Hello, everybody. I hope you guys are having a nice conference. I'm really looking forward to some of the presentations and events that are still to come. Before I get started with the introductions and everything, want to talk about a funny incident. So I'm sure you guys have heard or said often some of the reasons of why some applications should not be monitored. They don't need to be monitored. There's 4 people using it. There's hardly ever any load on it. It's very new. There's not an issue with it. The funniest that I've heard is, oh, it gets used all the time. The moment it goes down, customers pick up the phone, and give us a call. We know about it right away. We don't need it monitored. I really thought that was the height of excuses of why something doesn't need to be done. And that's what I want to hone in on a little bit, right? So there's a little bit of difference between installing an application and forgetting about it until you really need it, or adaptation, that actual behavior change, the muscle memory that you need to change to know, to remember what you need to do, change some things in your behavior about what needs to be done. We went through that with that approach at John Hancock. So I figured that was one major difference based on some of the stories that I've heard, some of the other folks that I've talked to, that I figured I will go in that direction. To give you a quick introduction, as Diane mentioned, I had the technical resolution team. I also had the rollout of New Relic across John Hancock. We are a global company known in United States as John Hancock, outside United States as Manulife. My role, purview, and everything about this presentation is limited to John Hancock, the US division. So we'll walk over that. As you can see with some of the numbers, $1 trillion, a lot of money, a lot of work goes on, a lot of applications. We're a 150-year-old company. What that means is we were the early IT adapters. We were there before IT was there, right? So financial services sector in general was an early adopter. So guess what? Even to date, we are using some of the mainframes. We are using some COBOL. We are using all those things that you may have heard of but never seen. And in cloud as well, the other end of the spectrum, we are also using the serverless architecture, microservices in the cloud, all of that, and everything in between, right? You have heard it, you've thought of it, you name it, we've got it. And we've got every version of these. So that gives you an idea of the landscape I'm talking about. Since IT started, since computers started getting used for business, we've had every year, every few years, new technologies coming in, new things coming in, and guess what? Things are written to replace them. The old one usually never goes away, right? The new one does its job. Now the problem becomes, as this starts getting accumulated, how do you maintain it? How do you monitor it? We're going to talk about that a little bit. 600 plus applications, just to give you an idea, hosted on multiple models. We have data centers. We have vendors who host our applications. We have SaaS applications. You name it, we've got everything. Thousands of IT professionals who support all these applications. Give you a picture of the before New Relic. And I'm going to go through this a little faster so that we can spend more time towards the more meaty part of the slides later. But at the beginning, we had disparate monitoring solutions. Essentially, whoever owned the application decided what they needed to do. They'd get whatever they wanted to get. Most of the applications, though, did not have any monitoring or had basic hardware monitoring in place. Vendors had basic hardware monitoring in place. Guess what? The visibility. Who had the visibility? Maybe those ops teams or the vendors, they had the visibility. Hardly anybody else knew what's going on with that. The problem is, though, the applications talk to each other all the time. Application 1 does stuff, passes it on to the application 2 and passes it on to application 3. If application 1 is with one vendor, application 2 has no monitoring at all, and application 3 has another vendor with monitoring implemented. The people who are trying to solve it do not ever get the complete picture. Even they don't even get the incomplete picture. It's very hard to understand what they should be doing. What was the result? We had large holes in our monitoring solution. That was very evident. To give you a very quick example, what would happen if we had performance issues? Maybe a batch is running slow or a web page is running slow. Guess what? The dev team or the application team that's supporting it, well, they had access to logs, but that's about it, right? They can't capture a lot of the information and CPUs and all of that. Well, who does it need for that? They need the admins, DBAs, and all of that. How easy is it in a large firm to get those kinds of resources allocated when you have an issue? Once you get them, it takes hours to get them on the phone calls, resolve the issues, identify all of that. I'm sure you can relate to that, right? Similarly, when you had application errors, there's an error that's happening in production, not happening anywhere else. Guess what? Try and reproduce it in your lower environments before you know what you're going to do to fix it. So you can code debug and all of that. Well, best of luck with that. So now you also need architects getting involved, trying to help you understand what you need to do. Picture gets even more complicated. As a result, what was happening over the years is our priority incidents kept increasing more and more. There was a need for better monitoring, clearly evident. We were barely reactive. When I say barely reactive mode is when something goes down, you go and do something about it. Proactive is when you do something about it before it happens, you go look for warning indicators. We were barely reactive because in some applications, they were not being monitored. Issues would happen. We would not know about it until somebody told us about that, until somebody complained about that, right? So we were barely reactive, and the idea was we wanted to be proactive. We wanted to get ahead of that to minimize those incidents, to resolve the issues if and when they happen. We wanted to increase our understanding of the application behavior in production. What happens when applications are written 20 years ago by your own teams? Well, those guys have moved on, right? And the new people who may be supporting it don't understand those applications very well. Moreover, whatever they understand about it, they don't understand how they behave in production, right? And that is a game changer if you can understand that, and that's what we wanted to go for. It was very evident. We needed a central monitoring standard. This would help multiple applications, 600 plus applications across business units, right? This is what is needed for us to tell individual application owners, decision makers, this is the application that as a company we're using or this is the approach that we are taking to monitoring these applications. So please use this particular application so that when I have to go from one team's application to second team's application throughout the workflow, that the information is available in one place. I don't have to switch switch tools and all of that. Well, that's where enters New Relic. When we had that realization, we spent a lot of time reviewing a lot of our vendors, a lot of potential vendors, I would say, and some existing vendors. And at that point, the decision was made to go with New Relic. What I'm going to focus on more is what does it take to succeed once you get New Relic, right? So before that, though, we're all a product of our environment, right? So what else was happening when this was happening? Move to cloud. We are actively moving to cloud. That is something we're doing across the board. Native applications being written in cloud, existing applications being moved in IaaS. We're in PaaS. We're in multiple type of environments, largely in Azure, a little bit in AWS. We're also moving heavily into Agile, and as a result, also in DevOps, right? Heavily. In fact, we are, the New Relic program happens to be part of the larger DevOps program. Even though we're running it independently, it is part of the larger DevOps program. And Agile-wise, while we're doing Scrum and Safe, most of the company, we are doing some very innovative TDD and pairing kind of combined processes as well. And that paradigm shift that happens when you move from older ways of doing things to Agile, that is what the company was going through. And again, we had a very clear goal lined out that all these things, this is the direction we're moving in. We have dates and timelines set that by this year, this and that will be complete. So everybody understands that this is what we're doing. With that, with New Relic, our CIO, COO essentially looks at that and says, you can have all this money to get this new shiny tool that you want. But I don't want this to be another thing that we acquire, that we install somewhere, and then it's lying around with nobody using it, and it hasn't changed anything. The CIO also sees the need and all of that. It sets a very clear goal for us. All applications in production must be monitored by New Relic within 1 year. Very clear, very unambiguous goal, very ambitious. But this, if there's one thing in the whole process that I were to say that makes a difference in our adaptation process, that was this particular goal, where when you approach different teams to do different things, you don't have to make a sale, right? You want to convince people. You don't want a mandate to be communicated to everybody as such. You want to make a sale to each individual team, want to convince them they want to use it. But when they know that the decision has already been made, our top management has set a clear goal, making that sale, overcoming that resistance, that initial resistance, makes a huge difference. Now, we could easily say, go with the first hunch, set up a certain monitoring structure, ownership structure within the monitoring, and have those teams essentially install it and install the easiest components first. The hardest components can wait, like APM can wait. The ones that are giving you more information, the ones that are going to give you more return on investment can wait. And even if you install it, if your developers are still, when they're trying to solve a problem, going to the application logs first, before they go to the wealth of data that's already gathered, it's useless, right? So how do you go about it, right? So it's one of those things. New Relic gathers a lot of data for you. Data is useless if you're not using it, if you're not looking at it, if you're not getting information, inferences out of it. So it reminds me of a line from Spider-Man, right? With great power comes great responsibility, right? So that's essentially what it is. There's great power in that data. It is your responsibility to use it, to understand it, to make inferences from it. But that will not happen just because the data is sitting somewhere on a website that nobody is going to check, or even if somebody's going to log in every day, that's not going to make any change. How you look at it, take the horse to water, make the horse drink the water, that's the difference. Until you actually use that data, so what kind of team structure would allow you to use that? That was the key question for us. We had a clear goal set, right? Across tiers, across hardware and software. if we were talking about server monitoring, it was very easy. Who owns it? Ops owns it. Very easy, straightforward, clear, no question about it, no contention. When it comes to applications, it's a little tricky, right? So ops owns monitoring applications that they don't understand. That doesn't make sense, right? They only understand so much about the applications. So we had a few areas to consider. Ops team owns all the monitoring. As I mentioned, there were pros and there were cons of that. They go and tell the application teams the detail level monitoring has to be put in place, and they're like, what do you know about my applications? What are you going to do with the data? It's going to be useless. Won't happen. What do you do? An alternative, central monitoring team. You set up a central monitoring team that does that, understands applications better. Still, they don't understand applications too much in detail. And the problem is, if the application teams whose behavior you're trying to modify are not going through the effort of setting up New Relic, the learning process, they're not traveling through the maturity curve, they are not going to use the application. It's going to sit there. Well, the other alternative is each application team should be asked to own monitoring of their applications. Good, very good, except how do you scale it? How do you walk every 600 applications, right? So a lot of teams we're talking about. How do you walk those teams through the maturity curve of, oh, listen, let's start with synthetic monitoring. Easy. Now let's go through with APM. Oh my God, so much data. What do I do now? Let's then move to this. There's a lot of guidance needed, and that's a lot of commitment. Guiding all these teams, and who is going to guide it? That's the problem. You don't have a central monitoring team. So what? What did John Hancock do? We did a hybrid solution. We set up a center of excellence. I had that center of excellence for now. The center of excellence set up to drive the effort, drive the absorbing of New Relic across the company, but the key piece here is this center of excellence is not the central monitoring team. This is not the do team. This is the team that guides and advises the teams that own applications. And they are made to own monitoring as well. And these are the teams that you guide through the maturity curve, train them through, develop expertise within those teams as you go through it. But you can't scale that. It's okay for applications with 20, 30 teams, business units with 20, 30 applications. Absolutely, you can do that. What about a business unit where we had more than 100 applications? That wasn't working out. So what did we do? Within that business unit, we did a central monitoring team that is still working through the Center of Excellence group. But for every other BU, we are going through the individual application teams owning. And as I mentioned already, the culture change is very important. Installing it, but anytime there's a production issue, anytime there's a question about something in production, people are not thinking about how could New Relic help me answer this question. Then installing it is a way. So how do you go about that? That you have to, we'll talk a little bit more about monitoring maturity curve in a little while, but that's what you need to walk the teams through. I'll skim through this slide very quickly. First, what we did was we know New Relic. We don't know each of the 600 applications. So we meet with teams. We start with explaining what New Relic's capabilities are. Second set of meetings, we ask the teams to explain to us what their applications architecture is, server layouts are, how is it deployed, where is it deployed, et cetera. And at the end of it, we give them a proposal. We tell them these many server monitors or infrastructure monitors go on these servers. This APM will make sense for you. This is the practice that you're going to follow with that APM. These are the plugins that will make sense. And if there's an extra acquisition needed for any of the plugins, that's where the suggestions are made. And obviously continue with the periodic check-ins. Why are the periodic check-ins needed? Periodic check-ins are needed for, again, guiding them through the maturity curve. Getting the buy-in, very important. It's very important to get the buy-in. Otherwise, teams would do the bare minimum that's needed. If it's just a mandate, they would do the bare minimum that's needed to earn them a check mark. So getting a buy-in is important. Another way is that we found worked for us very well was highlighting the wins and success stories to top leadership. Guess what? We do monthly reports for the program. Progress across the company goes to the top leadership. And we highlight a success story in it every month. And highlighting that success story, what does that do? So the first report that goes out highlights, let's say, one team success story, says, oh, this team did awesome. They used this, and in no time they could do this and that with it. Immediately, there are other IT leaders who are queuing up, and what do I need to do to be on there, right? They're making sure that they're not seen as laggards on the IT side when BUs are pitted against each other in a way in comparison, right? So nurture an internal community, that's very important, so that you build expertise internally. Onto the maturity curve. There are different types of monitoring. When teams begin, you have to prioritize appropriately. Doing all of them together is not advisable. You should pick up which one component you're doing first. Maybe APM you're starting with. Maybe my suggestion is always to start with APM. That's the whole point of having the applications own it, application teams own it, and not the server teams. Because doing the infrastructure is going to be a jiffy, right? There's very limited variations that you can have. You can replicate it to scale very easily. APM, you cannot replicate to scale that easily because a lot of it is dependent on different types of technologies you're using, and every other application will be different than the last one. Similarly for the plugins, right? Plugins probably later on in the game. Synthetic, depending on where you are, whether browser is available with your APM or not, you may have to prioritize synthetics. But different types of monitoring, different small pieces, one step at a time. Alerts, that's the next step. Once you start getting components in place, default alerts only take you so far, right? What is very important is application is going down, alerts are generated, great, but if alerts are generated before application goes down on a warning symbol, that's what you're going after. So setting those right alerts for each application team is very important. Otherwise, it's a waste. If I'm going to find out about it the old way anyways, what's the point of having monitoring, right? So alerts is something that you have to consciously follow. Then another area that I would highlight is IT analytics. What do I mean by IT analytics? IT analytics is for people like myself, many of you in the room as well, who are responsible in some way, shape, or form for the application's software side, right, or hardware side. So you can go in the insights, you can run multiple analytics, give me the maximum response time, give me the database read rates and the quantity and all of that. That's IT analytics, right? But then there is business analytics that comes even after that. And we haven't reached that one yet. We're exploring it now, looking to explore it now. Business analytics is where, at the end of the day, how many insurances did you sell, right? Business information. You have all the data, right? So that's where your business, your audience is different, your information is different. From the same data, your inferences are different. Somebody is coming to the retirement RPS application, say contribution change page, and spending a lot of time on it, but did not end up making a change. Why? Why did that happen, right? So those are the kinds of areas that you may want to think about. Let's look at how that UX is designed. Maybe the user is confused and they can't make the right decisions. Those are business-driven decisions more than your IT issues as it is. That's your next stage. And those stages need to be guided through, in our case, through the Center of Excellence. Some tips. Number one tip that worked for us, Agile Mindset. If you want to sit in a room until you know every single answer, before you do anything about it, this is not the tool. This is a very complicated tool. There's a lot to know about it. Even after doing this for a year, I can tell you I barely know a small percentage of it, right? And there's a lot of capability, and it's a continuously moving thing. This is not the kind of area where you want to be 100% on top of everything that's happening in there before you do anything. What the right thing to do is know enough to get started. That's the typical Agile approach. Know enough to get started. Get started. I still remember the day when Mike and I started working on it. Mike's in this room here. He's one of the first adapters on this. When we started working on it, Mike had admin privileges on some of the servers. Within 1.5 hour meeting, the first time we were meeting, we were done talking about where we live, how many kids, and all of that stuff. And we had 8 servers already being monitored, APMs installed in a working session. We had people in the room, whoever had the right access. We started monitoring the application, install. We figured out of all the applications, we're going to find one cross-section where we're going to do stuff and then understand it. And by the end of those 1.5 hours, we knew more about it than we could have known after 10 such meetings where we were only going to do talking, right? So that's a heck of a lot important piece in there. You want to also highlight some metrics. These are the ones that we used. Some of you might find this useful for running these programs. We shared, as I mentioned, with our users, information like number of users, right? So this is where we needed our account team's help continuously. There's no easy way to know that. But it is important to know that in some areas, there were users knocking on the door asking for access, developers, because they're working on the next version and they want to know what's wrong with my application in production so that I can prioritize, have the discussion with the product owners about what to prioritize, right? Growth over a period, right? So this is one of the things we reported, how many APMs we were using in January, how many are we using in February, how many are we using, the one on the top left. Percent apps by status, this is where you're pitting BU to BU, right? How many apps they have, how many of them are monitored now, how many did they have last month, right? So what is the work going on there? I'd be remiss here if I did not talk about the speed bumps, right? So there's obviously we went on this journey. We worked in a lot of areas. There were a lot of speed bumps we stepped on. So in an enterprise financial services kind of industry, I would suspect many of you guys would have similar speed bumps. One of the areas, internal for us more, firewall, took a long time to resolve, right? Data is protected with well, literally with blood, right? So it's hard to get that. But we also had problem with older Java applications. Their old SSL was getting forced. We have a workaround in place. We're working on that with New Relic, but this is something that we had a problem with, where TLS 1.0 is being used, not because of anything else, just because the fact that applications are old. The environment is old. There is no new TLS on that to use, but when you use that, because of the way our IP filtering works, it does not do the right kind of handshake, and we had to put in specific IP addresses to allow, which is a temporary solution. So we're working on that. Another thing I would highlight there is, this is my experience, my opinion, take it for what it's worth. My opinion is, based on my experience, it seems like there's a sweet spot for New Relic, right? If it's last 20, 30 years of technologies, New Relic works well with it. If it's the next 5 years, New Relic works well with it. If it's an older technology, out of the box, you don't have a solution to get most of those things working. Remember that slide where VB and PB and access and progress and all those interesting stuff, or stuff that used to be interesting 30, 40 years ago, was there? Now that, there's nothing to do. So that's something to keep in mind when you're planning. Not to say that that cannot be done. Custom solutions. Any data that you can get anywhere in the application, you can throw over to Insights and do a lot with it, right? Custom solutions, the way we did it is we've prioritized the out-of-the-box solutions higher. 600 applications, you got to do the ones that you can knock out the park immediately, right? And then work on the ones you're going to labor. So that's how we prioritized it. IBM Technologies, that's an area where we've found, whether it is ISAM, whether it is IBM, other IBM solutions, generally because of the nature of what IBM allows, the information can be limiting. So that's an area that I want you guys to keep in mind when you plan this. We've had, of course, this one area that's caused us a lot of consternation is PMI Metrics within WebSphere. If WebSphere, PMI Metrics, getting that information like connection pools, sizes, and all that kind of information is important for you to get it in New Relic, that's something that's going to take considerable effort. Private locations, Azure deployable image, this is something, with synthetics, you can access everything over the public internet. If there are VPN-related sites, you need private locations. In our case, we want our private location servers to be based in Azure, and that's an area that we don't have a GA private locations deployable yet. So New Relic's working with us on that, and we're working on. Server agents. This did cause a bit of pain in a few areas, right? So first, deploying server agents is very easy. It's very easy. These are server agents that are now retired. It took you 30 seconds to deploy it on any Windows and Linux. And guess what? Majority of our systems are Windows and Linux, but not all of them. So the Windows and Linux, hundreds of them, within no time, we had 700 plus server agents deployed across the company. Guess what happened? Server agents are at end of life now. So we had to replace all of them with infrastructure, which the moment teams see the infrastructure, so of course, initially there is a pain, oh my God, you telling me I'll have to do it again, right? But the moment they see it, game changer, game changer. There's not been one team that has seen it and has not said anything. Forget about giving negative feedback. There's not been one team that has seen it and has not said anything. Everybody comes with hands down positive feedback on it because the amount of information available is huge. But keep in mind, still works for only Windows and Linux. We have Unix, Solaris, AIX, right? We have, you name it. And Nope, it still doesn't work with those. There are still the old plugins that we are using with some limited capability, but just want to you guys to keep that in mind. With that said, some happy endings. Some success stories I'll cover with you. A group improved performance by 3 seconds per page load by identifying tuning opportunities with a SQL getting executed multiple times. And I honestly am understating this. Not a group, multiple groups did that. There's this one specific group from which we have representation here that saved this time in 1 page load. That was very evident. This was one of the earlier successes. In synthetics, a group identified 100 plus megabytes of static file that was being served from our servers in Massachusetts to everywhere in the country, or wherever you would access it from. Well, what do you have Akamai CDN for, right? So this is what you identify and cache, mark it for Akamai, and guess what? Somebody accessing from Frisco is getting this delivered in Frisco for them. All that travel transfer is not happening. The time saved for them, the effort is saved for your servers, right? When we implemented synthetics, were we looking to save? Oh yeah, I want to do it because Akamai CDN. I want to optimize. No, right? These things happen when you have it already done in place. SQL Server plugin, right? So we had this very interesting instance where somebody installed it because they wanted to monitor their database. Shortly afterwards, they happened to have to move the database to a new server. Didn't realize. Sometime after that, issues started happening. Now, you would assume that you got a new server that at least is equally good, if not better than the last one. Apparently not. How do they find it out? They see the page life expectancy in the plugin monitor drastically reduce, right? And everything else was fine, but page life expectancy is going down. They would have spent weeks at the minimum in the past working with the DBAs and admins trying to find that the RAM on the new server is not the same as on the old one, right? And guess what? This thing makes it less than a day spent on trying to troubleshoot it. Insights. An application cluster of 3 servers apparently had a majority of load being handled by one server because of something that was done years ago that worked at that time, didn't work now. What was that doing? That one server happened to be the primary server, and application was getting overwhelmed very easily. Team used insights to identify that, and the moment that load problem was resolved, the application, this happened to be an application critical for our paychecks, right? So it was one of those things where you don't sell insurance. If you don't print contracts on time, you don't sell more insurance. You don't sell insurance, we don't get paid, right? And this directly impacted all of us. Similarly, another team, TIBCO team, actually used server API in synthetics, right? So what are they doing? Server agents of the past, and so now infrastructure can do this for you, but server agents of the past, you could not have said that you're going to exhaust memory, right? But the APIs were telling you that. So what did the team do? They wrote a synthetic monitor that goes to that API, checks, polls for that same information, and sets the alerts. And that team, in the past, had problem with this one server in production that when it goes down, a lot of services were unavailable. And it would go down from memory exhaustion whenever it would go down. And they got an alert the day after they deployed it to production. And they got ahead of it, and they resolved it, proactive. There are a lot of such stories that I can share these are honestly a very small handful of those from some of the groups initially that started. I'll be happy to share some more stories with anybody who wants to talk to me after this. But there is a lot of work left. When I look at all the work that's left for us to do, especially even before coming to this conference, but now after coming to this conference and seeing all the new things that are coming, there's so much ground for us to cover. There's so much that New Relic is doing. We recently acquired the infrastructure product. We recently increased our insights retention period. Those are areas for us to grow for sure. There's New Relic expert services that we're engaging with to do some of the custom solutioning that I talked about for custom events and all of that. There's some software analysis review that we're doing with the New Relic consultancy group. Honestly, business analytics, I think, is the biggest game changer. It'll take a lot of effort because there will be business users, a new different group of users who've not been involved so far. But before you involve them, I was just mentioning to somebody today that some folks very high up have recently asked access to New Relic. And my point was, I can give you, of course, we gave them access. We can give you access. What are you going to do in there, right? Until we create some meaningful dashboards for you, right? And that, I think, is the next big thing for us. When the business understands what is happening with the production applications, the right decisions can be made. I think that is going to be the next sliced bread for us. So with that, any questions? All right.
I don't believe it. He's covered a lot of ground, so let me just ask a general question. How many of you have that kind of really complex, diverse environment in your companies, where you've got mainframes, lots of old technology, different languages from the 60s or the 70s, and you're working today? Anybody? I saw one hand go up in the front. Does this kind of, you're not from John Hancock, are you? Because that would
No.
do you have that same kind of experience? Have you had that same kind of experience about bringing New Relic in and the complexity of really changing the culture inside the company was number one. And then number two, the other thing I think Navpreet spoke to that I really think is important is New Relic is incredibly powerful. You can get a lot of stuff out of the box, but the real extra value and the sizzle stuff is you become more of an expert and you know more about the functions and the features. Alerting is a great example. So anybody have any questions about any of that? He showed some of that in his maturity curve, and he talked about some of that, I thought, in the lessons learned. No questions?
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
What other monitoring tools are you using?
Oh, and please repeat the question.
Sure. So the question was, what other monitoring tools are you still using? I don't know how appropriate it is to name the names here, but
Sure.
I'm sorry? Almost everything that you've heard of. Almost everything that you've heard of. Every tool. So as I mentioned, there's John Hancock and there's Manulife. And if John Hancock is not using any of those tools, Manulife definitely is. Manulife, on a scale, I would say, is by order of magnitude, the problem is bigger, right? So there are teams that are dedicated within Manulife to monitor this. So they have central monitoring team from earlier in some areas, and then in some other areas, they also use pretty much everything. And some of the folks who are sitting here, we recently had a discussion where one of those contracts was up for renewal, right? And the question was, how much money will we save, right? Because the ask is whatever you're getting from there, you can get from here, right? Now, on top of it, there are also some other applications within which vendor-specific areas that we are getting, like Pega. We're using Pega applications. Pega has its own monitoring tool. We used New Relic to replace it, right? guess what happened? Well, there are some internals in the Pega application that out of the box, New Relic was not reporting on, some agents that when they go down and all of that. Guess what? The Pega developer actually worked with Don, right? Pega developer wrote, like, I think 2 or maybe 3 lines of code in Pega that gets the information out on a flat file. 1 line of code that Don helped us get to throw that over to Insights. And that thing is monitored. $25,000 a year contract, not needed anymore, right? And we're not canceling the contracts for all of them on the wholesale. Oh yeah, now we have New Relic, everything's going. We're being very judicious about it. Some of those we are extending for a temporary period of time just to make sure the coverage is there. But the reason so 2 things, right? One, we want a central monitoring standard, whatever it is. So then we agreed on New Relic, right? And there's a reason we agreed on New Relic for, right? So keeping that in mind, we are as a company moving from no monitoring and other monitoring to here. So I know I wasn't very specific with the names, but I hope I answered your question.
No, that's good, thanks.
All right. Yes, sir.
When you first decided to purchase New Relic, which modules did you decide on? And secondly, once you had it, how long did it take to get buy-in from the top to state that everything would be monitored in production within a year?
Very good question. Very good question. So let me tell you the modules that we did not get initially, right? So infrastructure was not out. We signed the contract, I think, a month or 2 before infrastructure was released. Insights, we only used, by default, you get a free 8 days insight. That's what we had. We did not get private locations, but I think that was a mistake. We should have gotten synthetic private locations along with synthetics. But everything else we did. We did synthetics. We did browser. We did very little mobile. And that's a factor of where we are as a company in applications that we are trying to monitor, right? And we did APM, big time, and browser, obviously, right? So I think that the right question is how much of those, right? So my suggestion on that will be start small. Not very small, but start reasonably small, depending on your company's procedures of amending a contract can be a project in itself in some places, right? So depending on that, you should decide what the right size for you to start is, but start with a little bit of everything. Because that way, from a John Hancock experience, I can tell you that going through the evaluation is harder. Evaluation of the product is harder. Once you have it, adding to it is easier, right? So it made sense for us to do that way. Any other questions?
How long did it take you to get approval from your CIO to go with Essential?
It wasn't just the CIO. There was a whole CTO organization involved, multiple other business units involved, and all of that. From engaging with New Relic to the final signing of the contract was 10 months for us. But that's that's more driven by our how we operate, with all the regulations and all of that we have to work with.
You mentioned the journey from you started for production applications mainly, right? So do you see today any value on extending these to lower environment staging, development, et cetera? Are you doing that today?
Yes, we are.
Can you repeat that one?
Yeah, sure. So the question is, you focused on production. Did you use it, implement it on the lower environments? So very good question. Of course, we don't want to do anything in production first. So the direction that we have for the teams is first do it in one non-prod environment, any non-prod environment that you think reflects, that'll give you confidence that if it works here, it'll work there, right? So that's the bare minimum. But on top of it, teams, depending on how they're structured and what they're doing, like if it's a vendor application, they don't need it in too many lower environments. If it's a self-developed application that was done earlier and we're not doing much about it now, they don't need it much, right? So they make the determination. But if it's an application actively in development now, they prefer to have it in test environment at the minimum. Many vendor applications have it in the test environment too. In the development environment, I would say there are very few teams that have it in the development environment, but that's a factor of development environments are ready to keel over anyways. They're usually that light, right? So in the cloud, though, most of the development environments that we have, we're setting it up from get-go. Whether it is IaaS or PaaS or whatever in cloud. So for example, in some applications we're moving to cloud, right? We're building infrastructure monitor in the image that is getting replicated, right? So every environment gets it.
So you went into this with a set of, you had a plan, and I'm just curious if in the course of your experiences with your Relic and your applications adopting monitoring, if you changed any of those plans.
Oh yes, all the time. That's the whole idea, right? So exactly what I'm saying. Don't fret about sitting in a room, worrying about everything possibly that can go wrong, knowing all the answers, making a plan, then going ahead, and then sticking to it. Not the right way to do it, right? So we went ahead with a very loose, very high-level plan. We had general guidelines, I would say, not even the plan. We really had guidelines, and we said it very clearly to the community that is involved in implementing it, that we're going to do it in an agile way. We're going to do it we have a clear direction, a clear goal, and a timeline, right? People have enough time in there. You have your day jobs, obviously, and so do I, right? So within that, do as much as you can, learn. If that changes your plan, and I can't even if I wanted to count, I can't count how many times we change direction, right? But in general, we knew that that's the goal we're hitting, and this is where we're going from. What do we need to do? All right. Yes, sir.
Is there new functionality or functionality coming that's helping you expand and helping this standardization, like baselines or
Then the one that I'm totally, completely excited about is distributed tracing. And specifically the reason for that is, remember I mentioned, right, applications have a lot of tiers. Applications call applications. And then specifically now that we're moving towards microservices, right? Microservices definitely call other microservices, otherwise they won't be microservices, right? So when all of that is happening, one challenge in the past that we've had is you can trace, for example, sometimes you would be interested in tracing somebody logs in, user A logs in from the browser and does something. What happened with that click? How did it go through the different tiers and what happened? So far, there was a lot of manual work we had to put in. With distributed tracing, now getting that handle of tier 1, this is what happened. In the second tier when it went, the same user, same transaction, same trip ID, this is what's happening. And in the third, this is what's happening, and that's where my problem is. Earlier, we had to make that connection, essentially trace on our own, and making that connection was challenging. So that, I think, is something that I'm really excited about. Now that, although, again, as I said, go APM heavy. If application monitoring, that's the key that I would say, the key takeaway from this one is, don't focus on hardware monitoring. There are a lot of solutions out there. New Relic is awesome. There are a lot of solutions out there. You want ROI, you want bang for the buck, you want to go with APM browser. These are your key. This is where the return on investment will show, which means you'll have to spend a lot of time as well.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.